The rain had been hammering Manhattan for 6 hours by the time Dominic Castellano stepped out of his private club that November night. He turned up the collar of his bespoke coat, the faint scar along his jaw catching the sickly yellow of the streetlights, and stood for a moment in the downpour like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by anything ordinary. He'd just closed a long evening, brushed off the usual flattery, endured the desperate pleas of men who thought they could bargain with him, listened to the hollow laughter of his lieutenants pretending they weren't afraid, and was walking toward his car with the unsettling calm of someone all of Lower Manhattan knew better than to cross. Then the boy stepped out of the shadows near the side entrance. He couldn't have been more than 22, thin as a blade, still in his busboy uniform that carried the smell of old fries and industrial cleaner. His apron hung loose and untied. His sneakers were so worn that the toes had been wrapped in duct tape, and on his wrist there was a fresh grease burn, still red, that Dominic could see from 6 feet away even through the rain. He wasn't begging. He held no cup, no sign. He just stood there, soaked and shivering, with the strange deliberateness of someone who'd been waiting for one specific person and had just found him. Dominic's scent hit the air before the boy spoke, that unmistakable alpha musk, tempered by age and power, and something darker beneath it, the smell of authority that made lesser men lower their eyes. But this boy didn't lower his eyes. He looked straight at Dominic with a desperate, trembling intensity that made the alpha pause. "Are you Dominic Castellano?" the boy asked. His voice was hoarse from the cold, and beneath that hoarseness, Dominic caught it, the faint, sweet undertone of an omega in distress. Not in heat. Not quite, but close enough that the instinct in Dominic's chest stirred like a waking beast. His bodyguard took a step forward, but Dominic raised a hand to stop him. "I am," he said. The boy pulled an old postcard from his pocket, its corners curled, soft at the creases the way things get when they've been carried against a body for a long time. The front showed a faded lighthouse somewhere on the Maine coast. He held it out to Dominic with trembling fingers. "My brother told me to find you," he said. "If he ever disappeared." Dominic didn't take it right away. He looked at the boy, really looked. The omega was beautiful in the way that desperate things often were, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, dark hair plastered to his forehead, lips turning blue from the cold. His scent was under everything, that omega sweetness that should have been carefully controlled with suppressants, but wasn't, not properly, not enough. Dominic's alpha instincts flared with an almost painful intensity. "How long have you been standing out here?" The boy hesitated. "This is the 3rd place. My brother made me memorize 3. I tried the other 2 first." Dominic took the postcard. He turned it over, and there, in handwriting he didn't recognize yet but soon would, were a few lines that ran cold through his chest. "If you're reading this, I was right. Start where it all started. He knows the door." But it was the name in the bottom corner that stopped him entirely. Elias Marsh. A name he hadn't heard in 3 years. A name he'd been told had left quietly. No trouble at all. Dominic looked back up at the boy standing in the rain with his duct-taped sneakers and the eyes of someone long used to expecting nothing from anyone. And for the first time in years, Dominic Castellano felt that something inside his own kingdom had been kept from him. "Get in the car," Dominic said. The boy's eyes widened. "What?" "Get in the car, or I'll change my mind." The omega didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled toward the black sedan, his movements clumsy with cold and exhaustion, and Dominic caught himself reaching out to steady him, a gesture so instinctive it surprised them both. "Thank you," the boy whispered, and Dominic felt the warmth of his breath, faintly sweet even in the freezing rain. Dominic said nothing more on the sidewalk. He only gave a slight jerk of his head toward the end of the street where a small cafe had long since turned off its lights, and the boy understood that it was an order, not an invitation. He followed without a moment's hesitation. After all, he'd already spent 6 grueling hours searching through the rain and moving between locations just to track him down, and he wasn't about to back down now. The cafe belonged to Dominic. One of countless things that belonged to him that this city would never fully list. His bodyguard unlocked the door, then remained outside like a shadow. Inside, it was dark and warm, the smell of old roasted coffee still lingering in the air. Dominic pulled out a chair for the boy with an almost polite gesture, then went to the counter himself, turned on a single light, and made a cup of hot tea with the surprising ease of a man everyone assumed only knew how to order other people to do things like that. He set the cup down in front of the Omega. The boy wrapped both calloused hands around it, and Dominic saw them trembling, not exactly from the cold anymore, but from something that had been held back too long and was only now beginning to be allowed to leave. He sat down across from him, in no hurry, and placed the postcard on the table between them like a piece of evidence. "What's your name?" Dominic asked. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who didn't need to speak loudly for others to listen. But beneath that calm, his alpha instincts were humming with a strange, protective urgency. The boy swallowed. Leonardo Marsh. But everyone calls me Leo. Dominic gave one nod, committing it to memory. His eyes traced the line of Leo's throat, the way his Adam's apple moved when he swallowed, the pulse fluttering at the base of his jaw. An Omega without a pack, without protection, standing in the rain with a dead man's postcard and nothing but faith in a brother who'd vanished. "Tell me everything," Dominic said. "Start from the beginning." Leo's eyes flickered with something like relief, that someone was finally willing to listen, finally willing to believe. He took a shaky breath and began. "My brother went missing 10 days ago," he said. His voice broke on the word missing, as if hearing himself say it out loud for the first time made it real. "We've been running for 3 years. But 10 days ago, after he slipped back into the city to see me, he vanished into thin air. Not one call. Not one message. Nothing." Dominic watched him with the composure of a man who had learned to read people in order to survive. In what he read there was not lies or calculation, but the true fear of someone who had only one thing left in the world, and that thing had just vanished. "Have you gone to the police?" Dominic asked, though he'd already guessed the answer. Leo shook his head slowly. "He told me not to. Before everything happened, he told me again and again that if one day he disappeared, I absolutely mustn't go to the police. That they couldn't help. That the only person who could help was a man named Castellano." He lifted his eyes to Dominic, and in that gaze there was both confusion and a fragile trust he'd placed in the words of his absent brother. "I didn't even know who you were. I didn't know what you did. Why my brother trusted you. Why someone like you could help someone like me. He only told me to find you, and said you would understand when you saw the postcard." Dominic felt his chest tighten. Over all these years, people had come to him for every reason imaginable. To beg, to bargain, to plead for his forgiveness or mercy, to borrow power or hide beneath its shadow. But no one had ever stood in the rain for 6 hours just to hand him someone else's faith as if it were the last precious thing they owned. No one had ever told him that there was a man somewhere in the years that had passed who had quietly prepared a path for his younger Omega brother to find him as a last salvation. And no Omega had ever looked at him like that, like he was something other than terrifying. Dominic inhaled slowly, and Leo's scent hit him again, stronger now that they were in the warm, enclosed space. It was intoxicating, that sweet Omega pheromone, not quite suppressed enough to hide. Dominic's pupils dilated involuntarily, and he had to force himself to focus on the words, not the urge to wrap this shaking boy in his arms and never let anyone touch him again. "You're not taking suppressants," Dominic said, more bluntly than he meant to. Leo flushed scarlet. I can't afford them. Not anymore. I used to, but your brother disappeared, and you had to spend all your money tracking him down." "I understand." Leo nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Dominic pushed his own cup of tea aside and leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Your brother," he said slowly, one word at a time, "placed his trust in the wrong person. That happens often enough. But placing trust in the right person without knowing why, that's something else." Leo looked up, hope warring with fear in his dark eyes. "So you know him?" Dominic didn't answer at once. He only looked down at the postcard with the faded lighthouse and the name Elias Marsh that seemed to echo once more inside his mind, dragging with it a question he hadn't known had been lying there for 3 years. I knew a man named Elias Marsh, Dominic said carefully. He worked for me. An accountant. Bright. Quiet. He had a way of looking at numbers that made everyone else uncomfortable. That sounds like him, Leo whispered, and his scent flared with something like relief, something like hope. Dominic recognized that scent. It was the smell of an Omega who had been drowning alone and had just seen a hand reaching down. Dominic still hadn't answered his question about knowing Elias, and Leo, perhaps already used to seeing his questions drift into silence, didn't press him. Instead, he began to tell him slowly, as if saying everything in the right order was the only way to keep himself from being swallowed by it. My brother wasn't always like this, Leo said. I mean, he didn't always live like someone running away. There was a time when we lived normally. He came home from work on time. On weekends we cooked together. Everything was peaceful in a way I only now understand was precious. His hands tightened around the cup, and Dominic found himself tracking every movement, every flicker of emotion across that exhausted face. Then, about 3 years ago, everything changed. He started teaching me strange things. How to take different routes home from work. Never to take the same way 2 days in a row. How to look into the side mirrors of cars parked along the street to see whether anyone was behind me. How to stop in front of a glass window and pretend to look at something so I could see whether any reflection stopped with me. He taught me that if I saw the same face 3 times in one day in 3 different places, it wasn't a coincidence. Leo stopped, and when he went on, his voice was smaller. I used to think he was being too cautious. I used to laugh and tell him he'd watched too many detective movies. He didn't laugh back. He only looked at me and said that one day those things might keep me alive, and that I should memorize them the way I memorized how to breathe. Dominic listened without cutting in, and inside his mind, a picture was slowly taking shape. The portrait of a man who had spent years living with real fear, not the sick fear of a paranoid mind, but the cold, methodical vigilance of someone who knew exactly whom he was hiding from. What else? Dominic asked. Leo nodded. He made me memorize 3 locations. This restaurant, a club downtown, and an office building I'd never entered. He showed me pictures of each place, made me remember how to get there by subway, and on foot in case I didn't have money for the train. He even made me memorize the times, which evenings of the week you were usually where, and where I should try first if I needed to find you. His voice cracked again, and Dominic felt the alpha instinct surge, the need to protect, to provide, to claim. He pushed it down ruthlessly. I asked him who that man was, why he mattered so much. And he only said that he was the only person in this city who owed him the truth. And that when the time came, that truth would speak for itself. At that point, something inside Dominic went still. Because the name Elias Marsh, when he'd first seen it in the rain, had been only a vaguely familiar sound. But now, when it was placed beside those evasive maneuvers, the constant vigilance, and an office building, his memory finally opened the right drawer. Elias Marsh, the young accountant who had once worked for his construction company, one of the clean and legal branches of business he used to wash his name before the world. A thin, quiet young man with glasses and the irritating habit of looking people straight in the eye when he spoke. The one who'd left 3 years ago. The one Gideon Vance, his longtime right hand, had reported back on in his usual smooth voice, saying the young man had resigned peacefully, no complications, no problems. A departure so tidy that Dominic hadn't even bothered to ask one more question. 3 years. Exactly 3 years ago, matching the very point in time Leo had just mentioned, the point when his brother began changing his routes home and counting unfamiliar faces. Dominic let no emotion show on his face. He was far too skilled at hiding things. But beneath that composure, a thought had sparked and flashed through him, thin and sharp as a pulled thread, that a man did not simply resign peacefully and then spend 3 years teaching his Omega brother how to run. He looked at Leo and asked, in a voice that sounded indifferent but was not indifferent at all. "What did your brother do for work before all of this started?" "He was an accountant," Leo said. "He was good with numbers. So good it was almost strange. When we were little, I used to see him glance over a page full of numbers and point right at one line and say, 'This part is wrong,' without needing to calculate anything, as if the numbers had told him by themselves whenever they were lying." Dominic did not answer those words aloud, but inside him, a door he had closed and long forgotten softly opened, and memory came flooding back with a clarity that almost startled him. It had been a late afternoon many years earlier, in the meeting room on the upper floor of the construction company, where the last sunlight of the day slanted through the large panes of glass and fell across the long polished table. Around that table had been Dominic's familiar men who knew how to nod at the right time and stay silent in the right places, men who'd never dared tell him anything except what he wanted to hear. And then there had been the thin young man with glasses sitting at the end of the table, a man who'd been hired less than a year earlier, standing up in the middle of the meeting, placing a file in front of Dominic, and saying in a calm but clear voice that a number here didn't match. The whole room went silent. The men around the table glanced at one another, a few turning pale, because no one pointed directly at a report prepared by Dominic's own trusted men and said there was a problem with it. No one did that in front of him and lived peacefully to tell the story. Dominic remembered lifting his head slowly and looking straight into that young man's eyes, waiting for the familiar fear to appear, the way it always appeared on the face of anyone who dared stand between him and something unpleasant. But that fear did not come. Elias Marsh only looked back at him, not challenging, not shrinking, simply standing there with the truth in his hands like a man carrying something too heavy but refusing to set it down. "There is money going out with no matching money coming in," he'd said. "It could just be a recording error. But if it isn't, then you should be the one to know before anyone else." Dominic had not become angry, which he still remembered afterward. He should have been angry, should have taken it as insolence. But instead, he'd felt something close to respect, that rare feeling of a man who'd spent his whole life surrounded by flattery suddenly hearing one honest sentence. He'd taken the file, given one nod, and said thank you. 2 words he rarely said to anyone. And then, like everything else in his world, he'd handed it to the person he'd always trusted with such things, Gideon Vance. He'd given the file to Gideon and told him to look it over and see whether that young accountant was right or wrong. Gideon, with his silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses and the measured voice that had served Dominic's family through 2 generations, had taken the file, smiled kindly, and a few days later returned to say the boy was eager but inexperienced, that he'd mistaken an advance payment for a missing sum, that everything was actually perfectly fine. And Dominic had believed him. Of course he'd believed him. He'd trusted Gideon on that day, just as he'd trusted Gideon on every other day, without a single flicker of suspicion, because there are certain kinds of trust people never think to place on a scale. Now, sitting in the dim cafe across from that young man's Omega brother, Dominic realized that he'd never seen Elias Marsh again not long after that meeting. A few months, perhaps, and yet he'd accepted that sudden departure without a second thought. He, Dominic Castellano, the man people believed missed nothing that happened inside his own kingdom, had simply let it go without asking a single question. He looked at Leo through the weak yellow light, and for the first time since the Omega had stepped out of the darkness, he felt not curiosity, but something heavier, something close to the feeling of a man who'd just realized the door he thought he'd locked long ago had never truly been closed. Leo was trembling again. Dominic could smell it in his pheromones, the sharp, sour scent of fear mixing with that underlying sweetness that made his alpha instincts howl. Without thinking, Dominic reached across the table and took Leo's hand. "Leo," he said softly, "look at me." The Omega's eyes lifted, wide and dark and full of that desperate trust that made Dominic's chest ache. "I will find your brother," Dominic said. "I swear it on my name. No one in this city can keep a secret from me for long. Your brother trusted me for a reason. Now I need you to trust me too." Leo's fingers curled around his, and Dominic felt the trembling ease slightly. I don't have anyone else, Leo whispered. I've been alone for 10 days. Before that, I had Elias. Before that, no one. I don't know how to trust anyone. I don't know how to. His voice broke, and before Dominic could stop himself, he was out of his chair, kneeling in front of the Omega, his hands cupping Leo's face with a gentleness that surprised them both. You don't have to know, Dominic said. You just have to let me take care of it. Let me take care of you. And in that moment, looking at the boy with the duct-taped shoes and the exhausted eyes and the scent that called to something primal in Dominic's soul, he knew he meant it. Not as a crime lord protecting a witness. Not as a powerful man helping a helpless child. But as an alpha, called to an Omega in need. And something more. Something that felt terrifyingly like the beginning of something he'd never dared to want. Leo leaned into his touch, and Dominic felt the Omega's scent shift, from fear to something softer, something like trust. Like surrender. And Dominic Castellano, who had never surrendered to anyone in his life, felt himself falling into those dark eyes like a man stepping off a cliff. Dominic stood, walked to a corner of the cafe where the light did not reach, and took out his phone to call a number he didn't need to search for in his contacts. The person who answered on the other end was Marlene Cho, his security advisor, a woman who'd spent many years as an investigator before leaving the force and stepping into Dominic's world. The person he called whenever he needed something done in absolute silence and with absolute precision. He spoke softly, in short, concise sentences, and Marlene listened in the way of someone already rearranging her entire evening in her mind. He told her about the Omega and the rain, about the postcard, about the name Elias Marsh. And he heard a brief silence on the other end, the silence of someone who'd just realized this was no small matter. Elias Marsh, Marlene repeated. Your former accountant. Yes. Supposed to have resigned 3 years ago. I want to know exactly what happened when he left. I want to know who handled the paperwork, who signed it, who was the last person to speak with him. And I want to know everything Gideon did in connection with him. Every single thing. Without Gideon knowing anyone is asking. He paused for one beat. Gideon absolutely mustn't know. On the other end of the line, Marlene didn't ask why, because in all her years working for Dominic, she'd learned that when he demanded secrecy around a specific name, that name itself was the answer. She only said she would begin that very night, and that she would also have people find out whether there was any trace of Elias over the past 3 years, because a man who vanished that thoroughly usually left behind absences with their own shape. Dominic ended the call, stood still for a while in the darkness, then returned to the table. Leo was still sitting there, both hands still wrapped around the cup of tea that had gone cold, and he realized the Omega had stopped trembling, not because he'd grown warm, but because he was exhausted. The exhaustion of someone who'd held herself taut for too long and had finally reached his limit. You can't go back to where you were staying, Dominic said. Leo lifted his eyes, confused. I don't even have anywhere to go back to, he answered softly. Since my brother disappeared, I haven't dared sleep in my rented room anymore. I sleep in the break room at the diner or on the night trains. Dominic looked at him for a while, and something in the way he said that, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, touched him more deeply than the tears he didn't shed. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who would kill for his protection, his wealth, his power. But no one had ever spoken to him like this. Without demand, without calculation, with only the raw, unvarnished truth of being a poor, exhausted Omega with nowhere to go. I have an apartment, Dominic said. A safe place. No name attached to it. No one knows about it. You'll stay there tonight. And the night after that. However long it takes. Leo stared at him. Why? Why would you do this for a stranger? Dominic should have said it was for Elias, for the truth, for the lingering guilt he felt about letting Gideon's lies go unchallenged. But the truth came out simpler, rawer than he'd intended. Because I can't leave you out there alone. Because the thought of you sleeping on a night train or in a diner break room makes me want to burn the whole city down until I find you somewhere safe. That's why. Leo's eyes widened. His scent shifted, sweetened, and Dominic felt the change like a physical blow. He knew what that scent meant. An Omega's instinctive response to an Alpha's declaration of protectiveness. The beginning of something more primal, more binding. I don't understand, Leo whispered. But there was something in his voice that wasn't confusion. It was hope. Fragile and raw and terrified. You don't have to understand, Dominic said. You just have to let me help. He called the bodyguard in, gave a few instructions, and ordered him to take Leo to the apartment. A place guarded without display, with a kitchen stocked, a bed made, clothes in the closet for whoever might need them. A place that had never been used before, but that Dominic had always kept ready, for reasons he'd never fully understood until now. That night, for the first time in many weeks, Leo slept without jolting awake at every footstep in the hallway. A deep and empty sleep belonging to someone finally allowed to let go. Dominic had left him at the apartment, had watched him sink into the bed like a man collapsing after a long war, and had felt his alpha instincts roar with satisfaction at seeing the Omega safe, warm, provided for. But in the silence of his penthouse later, Dominic lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell he was doing. He was Dominic Castellano, the most feared alpha in New York's underworld, and he'd just taken in a starving Omega he'd known for 6 hours like a stray puppy. He'd promised to protect him. He'd promised to find his brother. And he'd looked into Leo's dark, exhausted eyes and felt something shift inside him that he couldn't name. He thought about the way Leo's scent had changed when Dominic had knelt in front of him, from fear to trust to something softer, sweeter. He thought about the way the Omega had leaned into his touch. He thought about the desperate thread of hope in Leo's voice when he'd said, "I don't know how to trust anyone." And Dominic realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade to the chest, that he'd never wanted anything in his life the way he wanted to be worthy of that trust. The next morning, Dominic came to the apartment close to noon, and he found Leo awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and a small notebook resting on his lap. He looked very different from the Omega who'd stood soaked in the rain the night before, still tired, but no longer carrying that strained look of a cord about to snap. And when Dominic stepped inside, Leo hurriedly closed the notebook with both hands, an instinctive gesture of someone protecting the most precious thing they had. Dominic noticed it. He noticed everything, but he didn't ask right away. He sat down in the chair across from him and asked whether he'd slept, and Leo nodded, saying it had been a very long time since he'd slept like that. Then, perhaps because of the quietness of the room, perhaps because for the first time someone was willing to sit still and listen, he began to speak. And this time it wasn't about protocols of flight or unseen shadows, but about something much farther back. "My mother died when I was very small," Leo said. "So small that I can barely hold on to any clear memories of her. Only blurred pieces, the smell of some kind of cake, a soft song in the kitchen, hands dusted with flour. My father left not long after that. He didn't die. He simply left and never came back. And I learned early that there are absences colder than death." Dominic's chest tightened. "How old were you when your father left?" 5. Elias was only a teenager then, but he became everything I had. He took me on as if I were the very purpose of his life. He did everything he could so I would never have to feel deprived in the way a child should never have to feel. Leo's voice was even, carrying both gratitude and pain. He spoke of the way Elias had worked 2 or 3 jobs at once, going to school during the day and working at night, so Leo could keep going to school, so he could have books, so he could have a roof over his head. He spoke of the way Elias had never let him see him tired, though Leo knew he was exhausted. He spoke of the way Elias had always told him that as long as he studied properly, as long as he had a future, everything he did was worth it. "I once went to college," Leo said, and this time his voice sank a little. "But I had to leave before finishing when he fell into trouble, because I couldn't just keep standing there watching him carry everything alone forever." Dominic looked at the notebook in his hands and asked, in a voice gentler than he was used to using, "What is that?" Leo looked down at the notebook, and a smile passed across his lips, the first smile Dominic had seen on him. "This is my mother's recipe book. It's almost the only thing left of her. And the only thing we carried with us through every move over the past 3 years. We moved so many times I can't even count them. From one city to another, each time only able to take whatever could fit inside one bag. But a few weeks after we finally arrived here in New York, Elias realized they were closing in again. Every single time we moved, he reminded me of the first thing: don't forget Mom's notebook. There were things we left behind, clothes, belongings, even things I loved, but never this notebook. He always said it was the most precious thing in our family, and he made me keep it as if I were keeping my own life safe. He gently stroked the worn old cover with his fingertips as tenderly as if he were touching a hand. Dominic watched that gesture, watched the way he cherished a battered notebook from a dead mother as if it were priceless, and something stirred faintly in his mind, a vague question he could not yet name. Because in all his lifelong experience living among secrets, he learned that when a careful man like Elias Marsh repeated again and again that something was the most precious thing, it was very rarely only because of sentimental value. But Leo kept talking, and Dominic let him. He told him about his mother's recipes, about the birthday cake she used to make him every year, about the way Elias had kept the tradition alive even after she died. He told him about the small, ordinary moments that had become extraordinary only in retrospect. The times they'd cooked together, the times they'd laughed, the times Leo had felt safe. And as he spoke, Dominic noticed that his scent was changing again. The fear was fading. The exhaustion was lifting. In its place was something warmer, the scent of an Omega who had found a safe place to land. You really care about him, don't you? Dominic asked softly. Your brother. Leo's eyes shone. He's everything. He's the only family I've ever had. The only person who's ever loved me unconditionally. And I can't lose him. I've already lost everyone else. If I lose him too, I don't know what I'll do. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and Dominic felt something break inside him. He'd been alone too, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. He'd never had anyone who loved him unconditionally. He'd never had anyone who would sacrifice everything for him. And looking at Leo, he saw the mirror of his own loneliness reflected back, and he wanted desperately to fill that void. Leo, Dominic said, and his voice was hoarse. I promise you, I will find your brother. Whatever it takes. Whoever I have to destroy, I will bring him back to you. Leo's eyes searched his face, and Dominic could see the warring emotions there. Hope and fear, trust and suspicion. Why? Leo whispered again. Why do you care so much? Dominic should have given an easy answer. He should have said it was because Elias had been a good employee, because the truth mattered, because he owed it to the Marsh family. But when he opened his mouth, the truth came out in its purest form. Because I don't want to be alone anymore, Dominic said. And I think you don't either. Leo's breath caught. That's not a reason to help someone. That's not. It's the only reason that matters, Dominic said. And before Leo could argue, Dominic closed the distance between them and pressed his forehead against Leo's, his scent flooding the space between them with the warmth of an alpha's claim. I'm not asking for anything, Dominic murmured. I'm just telling you the truth. I see you. I see your pain, your fear, your exhaustion. And I want to protect you. Not because you're useful or because you can give me something, but because you deserve it. Because your brother saw something in me worth trusting, and I want to prove him right. Leo's hands came up to grip Dominic's wrists, his pulse fluttering against Dominic's skin. You don't even know me, he breathed. I know enough, Dominic said. And when Leo finally relaxed into the touch, when his sense softened into something like surrender, Dominic felt his heart crack open in a way it never had before. Later that day, while Leo rested in the other room, Dominic received Marlene's first report. He listened in absolute silence, not a single muscle on his face moving, his anger freezing into ice. There are people hunting an Omega right inside my city, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. An organized manhunt has been pursuing his brother for 3 years, and someone inside deliberately kept me from seeing it. Marlene didn't need to say the name out loud. They both knew it was Gideon Vance. They believe his brother left something behind. Dominic, she murmured over the line. They think he is carrying it without even knowing it himself. Dominic stood motionless by the window as the pieces began to move precisely inside his mind. A man as careful as Elias Marsh would never place a deadly secret in his Omega brother's hands in a way that allowed him to know he was holding it, because a person who didn't know what he carried couldn't reveal it under threat. He would hide it inside something Leo would never throw away, something he would cherish and carry through every single move. In that flash of clarity, Dominic remembered how Leo had hurriedly closed the old recipe book with both palms earlier that morning. He turned back toward the living room, a sudden urgency on his face. "The notebook," he said softly to himself. "The thing we need has been in this room from the beginning." Dominic sat down across from Leo, and in the gentlest voice he could manage, he told him that he needed to see his mother's notebook. Leo instinctively hugged it tightly to his chest, and Dominic didn't blame him for that. He only explained patiently that the men who'd been hunting him weren't doing it for random reasons, that they believed his brother had left something behind, and that Dominic was beginning to think that thing might be right there in his hands without his knowing it. Leo looked down at the notebook, then up at Dominic, the struggle clear on his face, because to him, this notebook was his mother, his childhood, everything that remained of a home, not a weapon in a war he didn't even understand. But he was also too tired of understanding nothing, and at last he placed the notebook on the table and opened it. Dominic and Marlene bent over the yellowed pages, covered in the soft, slanting handwriting of a woman long dead, recipes for cakes, stews, little notes in the margins about adding a bit more cinnamon or a bit less sugar. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, only the cookbook of an ordinary mother, and Dominic almost doubted his own reasoning. But then Leo turned to one page, and his hand stopped. "This is Mom's birthday cake recipe," he said softly, his voice trembling a little. "She made it for me every year when I was small. And after she died, Elias made it from this recipe for me on every birthday, never missing a year, not even during the hardest ones." Dominic looked at the page, and something immediately struck his eye, the eye of a man used to reading ledgers to find what did not belong. In the middle of the ingredient lines, written in the mother's handwriting, there were several numbers added in a different hand, newer, darker, the neat and precise handwriting of someone accustomed to working with numbers. Those numbers were hidden among the ingredients so cleverly that anyone glancing over them would assume they were measurements. But when Dominic read carefully, he realized they made no sense. No cake recipe would ever need numbers like that in an order like that. "Leo," he asked, "did your brother ever say anything about this notebook? About keeping it safe?" Leo frowned, searching through his memory, and then his eyes suddenly widened. "Yes. He used to joke about it. He said Mom's recipes were the most precious thing in our family, and that I had to memorize every number in them, that I mustn't get even one digit wrong. I thought he was joking. I thought he only wanted me to remember Mom's cake recipe exactly." His eyes lifted to Dominic, and the truth began to open in them like light entering a dark room. "He wasn't talking about making cake, was he?" Leo whispered. Dominic slowly shook his head. Marlene had already taken out paper and pen, and together they copied down the string of numbers hidden among the ingredient lines, arranging them in the exact order in which they appeared. And when the complete sequence appeared on the blank sheet of paper, Marlene let out a quiet sound. "This is a code," she said, "for a safe deposit box at a bank. I've seen enough to recognize this format." The whole room fell silent for a moment. Dominic straightened, and inside his mind, everything finally locked into place with perfect, chilling precision. "This is why they've been hunting you all this time," he told Leo. "Whoever is behind all of this knows your brother had something in his hands that could destroy him, some kind of evidence. But he doesn't know what that evidence is, doesn't know what form it takes, and doesn't know where it was hidden. That's why he couldn't simply destroy it. He had to find it. And the only thread leading to it for the past 3 years has been you, the Omega carrying the key to everything right beside him without ever knowing it." hidden inside the recipe for his own birthday cake. The bank stood in a quiet part of the city, an old building with stone columns, and the solemn atmosphere of places that had kept other people's secrets for hundreds of years. Dominic had arranged everything in a single morning, because there were doors that always opened for a man like him without questions being asked. And the number sequence hidden inside Leo's mother's birthday cake recipe turned out not only to be the code to the safe deposit box, but also matched the name Elias had registered 3 years earlier, a false name he'd used to rent that box in preparation for this exact day. They were led down into a basement room where rows of metal boxes lined the walls, and the bank employee pulled out the box bearing that exact number, placed it on the table in the center of the room, then quietly left, closing the door behind him. Only 3 people remained: Dominic, Marlene, and Leo, who stood close beside the box with his hands clenched together because he understood that whatever lay inside it was the very thing that had taken his brother from him. The reason for all those years of running, for the roundabout routes, for the fear that had become as ordinary as breathing. Dominic looked at him, and with a silent gesture, he yielded the moment to Leo. "You should be the one to open it," he said. "Your brother left it for you." Leo placed his hand on the lid, drew in a deep breath, and opened it. In that moment, no one breathed. Inside the box, there was no gold, no money, nothing glittering at all. Only 2 items lying side by side against the cold metal. The first was a small black memory card, no bigger than a fingertip, silent and tiny, so small it almost seemed absurd to imagine that something so little could be what people had hunted for 3 years. The second was a neatly folded stack of papers, 4 pages, covered from top to bottom in careful, even handwriting. Dominic picked up the papers first, and the instant his eyes touched the first lines, something in his chest tightened because he recognized that handwriting. It was the same handwriting on the back of the postcard with the faded lighthouse, the handwriting that had chilled his whole chest on the rainy night when Leo stepped out of the darkness. The handwriting of a man he'd once believed had left quietly. Leo looked at the papers in his hand, and his voice broke. "That's his handwriting," he whispered. "That's Elias's handwriting." Dominic nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the page. Marlene quietly took the memory card, handling it as if it were something fragile, and said softly that she needed to get it to the analysis team immediately, that whatever was on it had to be copied and protected before anything else happened. But Dominic barely heard her. His eyes had been seized by the 4 pages, by the first line Elias Marsh had written, a line that opened with Dominic's own name. As if that man 3 years earlier had sat down and written this letter with the cold certainty that one day it would end up in exactly these hands. Dominic pulled over a chair, sat beneath the basement room's light, and amid the breathless silence of the 2 people waiting, he began to read what the young accountant from years ago had left for him. The truth he'd carried for 3 years and hidden behind a mother's cake recipe. The letter began with his name, Mr. Castellano. And from the very first line, Dominic could feel the voice of the writer, calm, clear, without a trace of self-pity. Exactly the voice of the young accountant who'd once stood up in that meeting room years ago and pointed straight at a number that did not match. "If you are reading these lines," Elias had written, "then it means I am no longer here to tell you myself. And it also means that you have finally agreed to look at the thing you should have looked at 3 years ago. I am not writing to blame you. I am writing so you will know the truth, because you are the only person with enough power to do something about it." Dominic kept reading, and each line pulled him back to that afternoon in the meeting room he'd thought he'd forgotten. Elias wrote that the mismatched number he'd discovered that day was not a bookkeeping error as he'd once politely suggested, but the beginning of something much larger. After that meeting, he hadn't stopped. He'd quietly followed that stream of money night after night, and what he'd found made his blood run cold. There was an entire network of construction contracts that did not exist, projects that lived only on paper but had never broken ground, ghost contractors that were nothing but empty names created to legitimize the flow of money through those false contracts. Part of the company's money flowed steadily outward, month after month, year after year, into accounts that all eventually led back to one place. And the man behind that entire intricate machine, the man who designed it from the beginning and operated it in silence for so many years, was Gideon Vance. Dominic stopped at that name. He'd known it was coming, had felt it hanging in the air since the night before. But seeing it there, black on white, in the handwriting of a man who'd paid with his whole life to write it down, was something else entirely. Leo, standing beside him, saw his hand tighten around the edge of the page, and though he didn't understand everything that was happening, he understood that the name carried the weight of a blow. Dominic read on. Elias wrote that what made everything dangerous was not only the stolen money, but the way Gideon had built the entire structure. Every thread, every signature, every trace in the documents had been arranged so carefully that if anyone ever discovered it, the first person to be suspected, the person whose name appeared on the original papers, would not be Gideon, but Dominic himself. If the storm truly comes, Elias wrote, Gideon built an entire machine with his own boss as the shield, the one who would take the fall. I intended to bring everything I discovered to you. I believed you deserved to know that you were being betrayed by the man you trusted most. But Gideon knew first. He always knew everything before everyone else. And before I could come to see you, he called me into a private room. Dominic reached that part and felt something stab through his chest, because he could picture that scene far too clearly. The thin young man with glasses and the silver-haired man whose measured voice had once embodied absolute loyalty. He did not raise his voice, Elias wrote. He even smiled. He told me that if I brought this to you, he would need only one afternoon to build enough evidence to make me look like the thief, the one who'd created the entire structure for his own profit. And then he said the sentence I will never forget, the sentence that pushed me out of my own life for 3 years. Castellano trusts me more than he trusts some lowly accountant. Tell me, who do you think he will believe? Dominic stopped reading, and in that cold basement room, the silence became so heavy it could almost be heard. Because the most terrible thing about that sentence was not the threat, but the fact that Gideon had been right. He would have believed Gideon. He'd been believing him for years. Dominic drew in a breath and kept reading, and the letter shifted into a different tone, deeper, as if the writer had set down the facts and begun to speak about his own choices. I stood before that room and understood that there was no way back for me. In the world you live in, Mr. Castellano, I know very well what happens to someone suspected of being a traitor or a thief. People don't need a trial. They don't need real evidence. They only need you to believe I betrayed you. And Gideon held in his hands the power to decide what you would believe. If I stayed and spoke out, I would die with the name of a thief. And Leo would be left alone in the world with that name pressing down on his entire life. I couldn't let that happen. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I chose to disappear. Dominic read those lines and thought of Leo, of a man who'd carried his Omega brother since he was only a teenager, and now once again had placed him above his honor, above the truth, above even his own life. I know you will think I was a coward, Elias wrote, a man who ran instead of facing things. But I didn't run to hide. I ran to prepare. Because I understood something Gideon never expected, that an accusation without evidence is meaningless, but a mountain of undeniable proof can shake even the blindest trust. I knew that if I came to you that day with only a few papers and a number, you would believe Gideon. But if I waited, if I was patient, then his greed would betray him on its own. Dominic realized as he read to this point that this was exactly what had happened. Elias wrote that he'd spent 3 years quietly watching Gideon's machine from a distance, not to stop it, but to let it grow. He knew that a man like Gideon, once he'd gone that far, would never stop, that the scheme would swell larger and larger, with more ghost contracts, more money flowing through, and each new transaction would become another trace, another cord tightening around his neck. I waited until the structure was large enough that no explanation could cover it anymore, Elias wrote. Waited until every number became a confession all by itself. That is why I did not come sooner. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed the truth to become heavy enough that even you could not turn away from it. Then the letter reached the line that made Dominic stop the longest. People will ask why I chose you. A man this entire city fears, a man I should have avoided most of all. I asked myself that many nights, and the answer is because of that afternoon in the meeting room years ago, when I stood up and said a number didn't match. Everyone in the room waited for you to become angry, but you did not. You looked me straight in the eye, took the file, and said thank you. In your entire world, you were the only person that day who was not afraid of the truth. And I remembered that. I wagered my whole life, Leo's entire future, on the belief that the man who once said thank you to someone daring enough to speak the truth, no matter how surrounded he might be by lies, would choose to stand with that truth when he finally held it in his hands. I believed in the man you revealed for one moment, not the man you have to become every day. Dominic lowered the letter, and for a long while he could not say a word. Because in all his life spent among fear and flattery, no one had ever placed that kind of faith in him before. A faith not built on his power or his threats, but on something good that he himself had almost forgotten he once possessed. He looked at Leo standing beside him, at the tears streaming silently down the Omega's face, and he felt his heart crack open again. He believed in you, Leo whispered. Even when he had no reason to. He believed in you. Dominic reached out and pulled Leo into his arms, burying his face in the Omega's hair, breathing in his scent, that sweet, desperate scent of hope and trust and surrender. I won't let him down, Dominic said. I won't let either of you down. The memory card was handed over to Dominic's private analysis team, a small group of people who worked in absolute silence, people loyal only to him and who never asked why. They worked for several days straight in a sealed room, comparing every line of data Elias had left behind with the company's real books, and what they slowly reconstructed made even the most seasoned among them fall silent. The evidence the young accountant had gathered was not a few scattered pages, but a complete map, meticulous down to the smallest detail, drawing out Gideon Vance's entire machine from root to crown. Every ghost contract was recorded. Every false contractor was traced back to the empty name behind it. Every stream of money was followed through layer after layer of intermediary accounts until it reached its final point. And when the analysis team added everything together, the number that appeared made even Dominic go still. The money that had been siphoned away was not a small sum accumulated over a few years, but a massive current that had run for decades. A number so large it filled many pages when written out in full. But what chilled Dominic was not only the size of the number, but the length of time. Because when the analysis team traced the money back to its very beginning, they discovered that the machine had not started 3 years ago, nor 5 years or 10 years ago. It had begun long before, back when Dominic's father was still the man in charge, in the days before Dominic Castellano had ever sat in the chair he occupied now. Gideon Vance had not stolen through one generation of bosses, but through 2. He'd stolen from the father, then continued stealing from the son, smoothly and without interruption, as if the transfer of power from one generation to the next had simply been another opportunity for him to extend his machine. Dominic sat for a very long time before those numbers, and inside his mind, an old question finally found its answer. A question he'd never dared ask himself through all those years, which was why he'd trusted Gideon so completely. A trust absolute, unconditional, never requiring proof. The answer did not lie in Gideon himself, but in an afternoon many years earlier when his father was still alive. He remembered that room with piercing clarity, the weak light spilling through the curtains, and the thin hand of his dying father gripping his. His father, the man who'd taught him every rule of this world, the man Dominic had both feared and respected more than anyone, had looked at him with fading eyes and spoken words Dominic had carved into his heart like an oath. In this world, you won't be able to trust anyone. Everyone will betray you when the price is high enough. But there is one man you can trust with your eyes closed, and that man is Gideon. He carried this family through its worst years. He stood by me when everyone else ran. Keep him beside you and never doubt him. And Dominic had done exactly that. For all those years, he'd given Gideon Vance a trust he'd given no one else on earth. Not because of what Gideon had done for him, but because of the final words of a dying father. He had not trusted Gideon, he trusted his father. And Gideon through all those years had understood that very well. He'd hidden behind the shadow of a dead man, using a father's last words as an impenetrable shield, knowing with certainty that as long as he stood inside that shadow, no one, not even Dominic, would dare reach out and unmask him. Dominic looked down at the enormous number on the page, then looked toward the empty space where the memory of his father still seemed to linger. And for the first time in his life, he understood that even love and reverence for the dead could be turned into a weapon if they fell into the hands of someone patient enough and cold enough to use them. But Gideon Vance was not the sort of man who sat still and waited for the blade to fall. An old fox who'd slipped between the most dangerous people in the city for decades without once losing his footing, he never allowed himself to be passive. When Marlene's discreet questions began to spread, no matter how carefully they were carried out, there were still small ripples that reached the ears of a man accustomed to listening for every sound inside this underground kingdom. And Gideon, with the instincts of an old fox, smelled danger before it had fully taken shape. He understood that someone was digging into the past, that the name Elias Marsh had returned after 3 silent years, and he knew there was only one move left, which was to reach Dominic before the truth could. So one morning, Gideon came to Dominic on his own, without being summoned, wearing the manner of a loyal man worried for his master. He entered with his gold-rimmed glasses and neatly combed silver hair, carrying a thick file under one arm and the familiar kindly smile that had soothed Dominic through so many years. "I heard someone has been stirring up old matters," Gideon said, his measured voice full of concern. "And I couldn't sit still knowing someone was taking advantage of your kindness, Dominic." He placed the file on the desk and opened it with the unhurried ease of a man certain of the card in his hand. "That accountant, Elias Marsh," he said, shaking his head as if in sorrow. "I'd hoped I'd never have to mention that name again. You remember I told you he left quietly. The truth is, I hid something from you because I didn't want to trouble you with it. He left because I discovered he was siphoning money from the company." And then, with the mastery of a man who'd prepared for many days, Gideon began spreading before Dominic the forged documents he'd built with painstaking care. Bank statements counterfeited with delicate precision, signatures skillfully imitated, money trails rearranged so that every arrow pointed toward Elias. He was clever, Gideon said. Clever and dangerous. He created an entire system to steal. Then when he was about to be exposed, he ran and spent 3 years building an inverted story, turning himself into the victim and placing every sin on my head, the head of the man who has served your family faithfully for a lifetime. He leaned back, and his voice sank into something almost choked. Now he is even using his Omega brother. Think about it. A poor, pitiful Omega appearing at exactly the right moment with a tragic story. Isn't that the perfect way to reach your compassion? They're using you, Dominic. They know you have a heart you always try to hide, and they're aiming straight at it. Everything I've ever done in this life has been to protect your family. Your father understood that. He trusted me until his final breath. Are you really going to let a con man and a strange Omega destroy what you and your father and I have protected together for so many years? That was Gideon's calculated strike, using the dead father's name as his ultimate armor. He looked at Dominic with practiced sincerity, waiting for the words of a lifelong servant to outweigh those of a fugitive. In that silent room, Gideon staked everything on Dominic's lingering loyalty to the past. Dominic did not answer right away. He sat still in his chair, his hands clasped together, and let the silence stretch long enough for the confident smile on Gideon's lips to begin tightening just slightly. Because in that moment, between the forged documents spread across the desk and the name of his dead father just spoken like a charm, Dominic was not thinking about the numbers. Nor was he thinking about the intricate arguments the silver-haired man had just laid out before him. He was thinking about an afternoon many years ago. About a thin young man with glasses who'd stood up in a room full of men who only knew how to nod, and had looked straight into his eyes and said there was a number that did not match. He remembered that there'd been no fear in that young man's eyes. Only the truth held tightly in his hands like something too heavy, something he absolutely refused to set down. A con man did not look at people like that. A thief did not voluntarily point out the flaw in the very numbers he should have been trying to hide. Then Dominic thought of Leo. Of the rainy night when the Omega stepped out of the darkness with worn-out shoes wrapped in tape and the painful marks of his grueling kitchen shifts. A boy who'd stood in the rain for 6 whole hours not to beg for a single dollar, but only to deliver the trust of his absent brother. He thought of the way Leo held his mother's notebook against his chest, the way he stroked its worn old cover as tenderly as if touching the hand of someone long dead. He thought of Leo's scent changing from fear to trust when Dominic knelt in front of him. And he knew with a cold certainty beyond all evidence that no one could perform that. No scheme, no matter how elaborate, could create an Omega with hands calloused from waiting tables and a torn recipe book cherished like a treasure. That poverty was real. That fear was real. The love his brother had for him was real. So real that he'd traded away his entire life to keep him safe. And when Dominic finally lifted his eyes to Gideon, there was no doubt left in them. Only an icy stillness. All his life, Dominic realized, he'd mistaken longevity for loyalty. Gideon had exploited that blind spot for decades, hiding behind the memory of a deceived father. But honesty was not measured in years. It was measured in moments of truth. The young accountant had sacrificed everything for it, while the silver-haired man across from him had turned lies into a career. That blind inheritance ended here, in this room, at this exact moment. Dominic rose from his chair, and the shift in his posture instantly froze the air in the room, because Gideon, the man who'd been reading Dominic for so many years, for the first time could not read what was coming. "You were right about one thing, Gideon," Dominic said. His voice was low and even, more frightening than any shout. "My father trusted you until his final breath." He paused, and his eyes locked onto the silver-haired man. "That was the greatest mistake of his life. Because you thought the shadow of a dead man would protect you forever. But the dead are not here anymore. Only I am." The smile on Gideon's lips vanished completely, and for the first time in decades, the silver-haired man felt the solid ground beneath his feet begin to shift. He opened his mouth to speak, but Dominic had already turned and nodded to Marlene, who stood silently by the door, and she stepped forward and placed another file on the desk, far thicker than the forged documents Gideon had just spread out. And this time the pages were real. "This is what you should be looking at, Dominic." No, Dominic no longer called him by the old familiar tone. He opened the file slowly, page by page, and each page he turned was another piece of the machine Gideon had spent a lifetime building. "Ghost contracts," Dominic said, each word falling like drops of ice. "Contractors that do not exist. Money streams passing through layer after layer of accounts, all of them leading back to one place in the end. An accountant you thought you'd handled neatly spent 3 years rebuilding everything, one thread at a time, until there was no corner left for you to hide in." Gideon looked down at the pages, and his face, which had become far too skilled at concealment, failed this time to hold its composure. He tried to salvage what he could, his voice sinking into something almost pleading. "Dominic, your father told you to trust me. He held your hand and told you never to doubt me." And that was when Dominic said the thing that seemed to make the whole room go still to listen. "I was trying to trust you." But he didn't know you were siphoning his money while sitting beside his sickbed. You didn't just betray me, Gideon. You stole from the very man who placed his dying faith in you. The silence after that sentence was so heavy that Gideon could not speak, because no lie could remain standing before a truth that bare. Dominic closed the file, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into the cold calculation of a man delivering judgment. I could end this the way our world usually ends such things. You know that. And perhaps you've been waiting for it. But I won't give you that ease. He stood, walked to the window, and spoke without turning around. The originals of all this evidence, every number, every name, every trace, have been copied and stored in places even you cannot reach. As long as you live in silence, keep not 1 cent of the fortune you stole, and disappear from this city and from everything that ever belonged to me, that evidence will remain still. But if you touch that Omega, his brother, or anyone under my protection even once, then everything you've done over 30 years will be placed in the hands of people with enough power to turn the rest of your life into hell. He turned to face Gideon, and his eyes were cold as winter. You will live, Gideon, but you will live like a shadow, without power, without assets, without a name to hide behind. And every day you have left, you will know that life rests in my hands. Gideon stood there, the man who'd once been the second most powerful figure in this kingdom, now looking as if he'd aged 10 years in only a few minutes. All the wisdom he'd gathered over a lifetime, unable to find one move left to make. He looked at Dominic one final time, and in his eyes was the bitterness of a man who at last understood that the shadow he'd hidden behind for so long had vanished, that the son he'd thought was still bound by his father's last words had cut that cord himself. Then, without a single word, Gideon Vance turned away, walked out of the room, and stepped out of the world he'd lived on like a parasite for an entire lifetime, carrying nothing with him except the heavy silence of a man who'd lost everything and still had to go on living. Later that night, Dominic found Leo in the apartment, curled up on the couch with his mother's recipe book in his lap. The Omega's eyes were red-rimmed, and his scent was tinged with the sharpness of lingering fear. Dominic crossed the room slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal, and lowered himself onto the couch beside him. It's over, Dominic said quietly. Gideon is gone. He'll never hurt you or your brother again. Leo looked up at him, and there was something in his eyes that made Dominic's heart clench. Hope, yes, but also a fragile vulnerability that made Dominic want to protect him from everything in the world. He's really gone, Leo whispered. Elias is safe? Elias is safe, Dominic confirmed. And I've already sent people to find him. He'll be back here soon. I promise. Leo's breath caught, and then, all at once, he collapsed against Dominic, his body shaking with sobs, his hands gripping the Alpha's shirt, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had been crumbling for years. Dominic held him, his arms wrapping around the Omega's trembling form, his chin resting on Leo's dark hair. He didn't speak, because there were no words that could ease the weight of what Leo had carried. He just held on, letting the Omega cry until there were no tears left, letting his Alpha scent wash over Leo in a wave of warmth and safety. Eventually, Leo's sobs quieted into shaky breaths, and he lifted his head to look at Dominic. His face was blotchy and tear-stained, his eyes red and swollen, but he had never looked more beautiful to Dominic than in that moment. Raw, real, completely unguarded. Thank you, Leo whispered. For everything. For finding Elias. For protecting me. For believing me. Dominic cupped his cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. I didn't believe you because of the evidence, he said softly. I believed you because of you. Because when you looked at me with those eyes, I could see your brother in them. That same stubborn honesty that made me trust a stranger years ago. And because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Leo's eyes widened. Dominic, I know we've only known each other for a few days, Dominic interrupted, his voice rougher than intended. I know this is insane, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from me, my power, my money, my protection. But you, all you wanted was the truth. And your brother. And when you looked at me, you didn't see a crime lord. You saw someone worth trusting. His hand slid to the back of Leo's neck, gentle but firm, the Alpha's instinctive gesture of claiming. And that terrified me. It still terrifies me, because I don't know how to be the person your brother thought I was. But I want to try. For you. With you. Leo stared at him, breathless, and Dominic could see the war in his eyes, the fear of trusting again, the hope that maybe this time it would be different, the desperate need to believe. "I don't know how to do this," Leo admitted, his voice trembling. I've never had anyone. Not like this. Not someone who wanted to protect me just because I want you," Dominic said simply. "All of you. Your fear, your hope, your exhaustion. I want to carry it with you. I want to be the person you can lean on when you're too tired to stand alone." Leo's breath caught, and then he was kissing Dominic. A clumsy, desperate kiss that tasted like tears and salt, and something sweeter underneath. Dominic's hand tightened on the back of his neck, and he kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of a man who'd spent years building walls around his heart only to watch them crumble in a matter of days. "Stay with me," Dominic murmured against his lips. "When Elias comes back, you'll have your brother. But stay with me too. Let me be part of that family." Leo's hands fisted in his shirt, and he nodded, his forehead pressed to Dominic's. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I want to stay." It was Marlene who found Elias. With the memory card decoded and the network of sources she'd built over many years, she followed the faint traces he'd left behind, those absences with their own shape that she'd once spoken of, and all of them led to one place. A small coastal town in Maine, where a lighthouse stood quietly on a rocky point overlooking the ocean. The very lighthouse printed on the postcard Leo had handed to Dominic on that rainy night. When Marlene reported back, Dominic did something the people around him didn't expect. He said he would go himself. He drove for many hours north, out of the city, through forests turning the colors of late autumn, until the road narrowed into a thin strip of asphalt running along the coast, and the salty air came through the window glass. Elias lived in a small wooden house tucked at the foot of the lighthouse, a place so isolated it seemed almost forgotten by the world. And when Dominic knocked on the door, the man who opened it was the young accountant from years ago. Except now he was thinner, with more lines around his eyes, carrying the deep weariness of someone who'd lived too long in unbroken vigilance. The two men looked at each other across the doorway, and in that moment, no words were needed. All 3 years of silence seemed to settle between them. "The Omega is safe," Dominic said first, because he understood that this was the first thing this man needed to hear. Something in Elias's face loosened, not all of it, but the part that had been holding its breath in fear for his brother for so long was finally allowed to let go. "I know," he said softly. "Marlene messaged me this morning." They sat down at the rough wooden table overlooking the sea, and Elias told Dominic the last part of the truth, the part even the letter had not fully revealed. He'd not vanished by choice, nor had he staged a grand trap. 10 days earlier, he'd secretly slipped back into New York just to see Leo from afar, but Gideon's men had finally caught a whisper of his trail and began closing in. He knew that if he stayed near his brother, Leo would be caught up in it too. So he made a split-second decision to run with nothing but the clothes on his back, deliberately leading the hunters completely away from New York to keep his Omega brother safe. In those chaotic hours, unable to contact him directly without putting a target on his back, I managed to secretly send the old postcard to the diner where he worked, leaving him that desperate final instruction: find Dominic Castellano. Elias's voice cracked with raw emotion as he looked out at the ocean. I didn't want to leave him behind, but they were right on my heels. If I stayed, they would have caught us both. If I went to you myself, Gideon would have intercepted me before I ever reached your door. My only hope, my absolute last gamble, was that he could reach you safely as an innocent messenger, carrying a truth they didn't know he possessed. I spent every second of these past 2 weeks terrified that my absence would destroy him. Dominic looked at him, and in his voice was a question that had been haunting him for many days. You should have come to me 3 years ago. Elias slowly shook his head, his eyes turned toward the gray sea. I didn't run because I was afraid of you, Castellano. I ran because he had no one in the world but me. And if I was wrong, if you believed Gideon instead of me, then he would have had no one left at all. I couldn't gamble my brother's life on faith that hadn't been proven. I needed you to see the truth with your own eyes, not hear it from the mouth of someone Gideon could ruin in a single afternoon. Dominic fell silent because he understood, and there was nothing left to blame. He stood, walked to the door, and gave a signal. And when Leo stepped out of the car, when he saw his brother standing there on the threshold of the wooden house, alive and made of flesh and bone after all those long days when he'd thought he'd lost him forever, he froze for 1 second, then ran to him. The brothers clung to each other beside the windswept sea, unable to speak, with only the sound of the waves and the sobs of an Omega who'd finally found the only family he had in the world again. Dominic watched them, standing apart, and felt something settle in his chest, a warmth he'd never allowed himself to feel before. Several months later, on a quiet street in Brooklyn, a small diner opened its doors with a simple wooden sign hanging over the glass entrance. Inside, the smell of fresh-baked pastries drifted warmly from the kitchen every early morning, and regular customers began to come, not only for the food that tasted like home, but also for the strange sense of peace the place seemed to give. Leo stood behind the counter, still the same resilient Omega from years before, but now his hands no longer trembled. He moved with a newfound grace and confidence that came from finally being safe. He cooked from the recipes in his mother's notebook, and that notebook now rested on a small shelf in the kitchen, returned to its humble and rightful purpose, no longer a hiding place for deadly secrets, but simply a mother's recipes passed down to her child. Dominic had helped him open the diner quietly, without display, in the way of a man who understood that the most meaningful gift was not charity, but the chance to let someone stand on his own 2 feet. Elias lived in a small apartment only a few steps from the diner, and every evening, he sat at the familiar table by the window to help his brother keep the books. The numbers now no longer weapons or evidence, but only the ordinary numbers of a little diner growing day by day. The weariness that had been carved into him through 3 years finally began to fade, giving way to the gentle light of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. And on the wall near the cash register, inside a plain wooden frame, hung the old postcard with the faded Maine lighthouse, placed there not as a reminder of pain already past, but as a quiet testament that sometimes the right message placed in the right hands at the right moment can change everything. Late one night, after the diner had closed and Elias had gone home, Leo stood at the counter wiping down the surface, his movements slow and tired but content. Dominic appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching him with a soft smile. "You look like you belong here," Dominic said quietly. Leo looked up, and his eyes softened. "I feel like I belong here. For the first time in forever." Dominic crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floor, and came to stand behind Leo. His hands found Leo's waist, and he pulled the Omega back against his chest, burying his face in Leo's hair and breathing in his scent, that sweet, familiar scent that now smelled like home. "Thank you," Dominic murmured, "for staying, for trusting me, for giving me a reason to be something other than what I was." Leo turned in his arms, his hands coming up to rest on Dominic's chest. "You gave me a reason to hope," he said. "You showed me that the world isn't just filled with people who take. You showed me that it can also be filled with people who protect, who love." Dominic's heart swelled, and he leaned down to press his lips to Leo's. The kiss was soft, slow, full of all the things they'd learned to say without words. When they pulled apart, Leo's eyes were shining. "I love you," Leo whispered. "I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. But I've been through too much to pretend that what I feel isn't real." Dominic's chest tightened with something too big to name. "I love you too," he said. "And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Every day." Leo laughed, a bright, unexpected sound that made Dominic's heart soar. "You'll have to help me with the dishes, then. I can do that. And you'll have to eat my cooking and pretend to like it even when I burn the bread." "I already eat your cooking and pretend to like it." Leo shoved him playfully, and Dominic caught his hand, bringing it to his lips. And I'll protect you from everything that tries to hurt you. And I'll hold you when you're scared. And I'll never let you feel alone again. Leo's smile faded into something softer, more serious. I've been alone my whole life, Dominic. Even with Elias. Even when we were running together. I've always felt like I was the one who had to be strong. But with you, I can just be weak. I can just be scared. And you still want me anyway. Dominic cupped his face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. That's not weakness, he said. That's the bravest thing anyone can do. To show someone your fear and trust them not to use it against you. And I will never, ever use it against you. I will protect it like the most precious gift I've ever received. Leo leaned into his touch, his eyes closing. I love you, he said again, and the words were soft and sure and steady. Dominic kissed his forehead, then his nose, then his lips. I love you too, Leonardo Marsh. And I am never letting you go. The little diner became a sanctuary. Not just for Leo, but for everyone who walked through its doors. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the pies were always fresh, and the owners knew your name and asked about your day. It was the kind of place where people felt safe. Elias found his own peace there too. He would sit at his corner table with his ledger books, humming softly as he balanced numbers that were no longer heavy with hidden meanings. Sometimes, he'd look up at the old postcard on the wall and smile. He'd think about the 3 years of running, the 3 years of fear, the 3 years of wondering if he'd ever see his brother again. And he'd think about the man who'd made it all possible. Dominic Castellano came to the diner every evening at closing time, helping Leo wipe down the counters and clean the coffee machine. In the dim quiet of the empty restaurant, they'd talk about their days, or they'd just be silent together, comfortable in each other's presence. The alpha who'd once ruled Manhattan's underworld now spent his evenings washing dishes in a Brooklyn diner, and he'd never been happier. And if there is one thing this story wishes to leave behind, it is that true justice rarely takes the shape of burning revenge. It is not an explosion, nor a glorious moment of victory. Sometimes justice is simply the smell of bread fresh from the oven on an ordinary morning in a place where no one has to live in fear anymore. The deepest lesson those 3 people leave us is that trust should not be placed in status, in power, or in the number of years someone has stood beside us, but in the true nature of a person, in what they choose to do when the truth becomes inconvenient, and holding on to it means losing everything. An Omega busboy and an overlooked accountant, people the world often passes by without bothering to look back, turned out to be the most honest and courageous of all. And their dignity did not depend on wealth or power, but lived in the straightness of their hearts. Every person, no matter how humble, deserves to be respected and trusted for who they truly are.